In today's video, we're going to discuss some common misconceptions that people have when leaving Australia and becoming a non-Australian tax resident from the ATO perspective. Today, I'm joined by Bradley Murphy, who's a partner at Murphy Tax based in Melbourne, and they're expert in expat taxation from the ATO perspective. Bradley, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Shiraz. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Bradley, can you, from your experience, share some of the common misconceptions or myths that people have when they plan on going overseas, becoming a non-Australian tax resident?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a great question because there are some certainly misconceptions in terms of what it takes to become a non-tax resident of Australia. So I think that the most common misconception is that to become a non-tax resident, you effectively just need to spend less than 6 months of the income year in Australia, which is actually not quite true. So for Australian citizens looking to become a non-tax resident, there are three tests to satisfy. These tests are one, the resides test, two, the domicile test, and three, that 6 month rule. And the key test to look out for Australians looking to become a non-tax resident moving overseas is this domicile test. Now this test says that an Australian citizen or an Australian permanent resident must establish a permanent place of abode overseas. So that test, to satisfy that permanent place of abode test, really entails, moving your life overseas for that period of time, which is at least 2 years, but likely longer. And at the same time, making sure you've got permanent immigration rights in that country, a permanent visa, and cutting your ties to Australia to the extent possible.
Okay, and my next question is that, the idea of becoming a non-Australian tax resident means that in general perception that you no longer have any taxation to the ATO. But could there be cases where you have become a non-tax resident from an ATO perspective, but you still owe taxes to the ATO on a one-time or an ongoing basis?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, that's right. Because it's important to recognize, it is quite difficult to become a non-tax resident. So that you want to make sure you satisfy that criteria and you're not still seen to be a resident with the ATO. But secondly, once you do become a non-tax resident, it's important to recognize that non-tax residents of Australia still pay Australian tax on their Australian source income, which includes any investment income in Australia, rental income from property, capital gains from property, uh, dividend income from shares or capital gains from shares, Australian bank interest, or an Australian company that they might have as well. So income from an Australian company. However, it normally is a good tax outcome for Australians moving overseas and becoming a tax resident. If you a non-tax resident, sorry, if you can structure your affairs in a manner so that you can get your employment income or business income outside the Australian tax net in a legal manner, that can be quite an attractive tax outcome.
Thank you, Bradley. And my next question is that what could be some financial and legal risks involved with incorrectly declaring the tax residency status?
So basically, it's a system of self-assessment. So the taxpayer declares their own non-residency status on their Australian return. Now, the ATO expects the taxpayer to receive correct legal advice regarding that and to make sure they've got correct tax advice so that they've taken a position that's reasonable that they are, in fact, a non-tax resident. Now, if that's done incorrectly with the ATO, there can be penalties for making an incorrect declaration on your residency status. They include, potentially up to a 75% penalty on tax owed. So it's the shortfall tax owed plus a penalty of 75% or sometimes higher as well. So it's just really important just to make sure that, you've got advice before you leave Australia and that's done correctly to really satisfy the ATO and the commissioner in Australia that you've actually become a non-tax resident.
Okay, great point. I also see many times it happens in people from UK and Canada and even Australia that instead of taking legal advice from an expat tax expert, they go to their local accountant who are already doing their books for, let's say, past 4 or 5 years. And, based on the accountant's assessment, they just file to become a non-tax resident without getting any external legal advice. And this is where I feel I've seen are some loopholes that remains open, that comes back with some potential incorrect assessments and future penalties. So also from my side, I advise clients to take expat taxation opinions in addition to your local accountant opinions as well.
Yeah, I think that's very prudent, Shiraz, for sure. I think, it's like going to a specialist versus a GP, for example. I think it's a very specialized and niched area, and it's really important that you do work with a international tax specialist in this regard, especially because there are issues there that they're very much unique to expats as well. That they can be complex, and I think that it's never a straightforward outcome normally for non-residents in terms of their business and investment income. So yeah, just make sure you're getting the correct advice before you leave Australia.
Thank you, Bradley. And my next question is that let's say someone who has left Australia without doing the proper, self-assessment filings, and there are some mistakes down the road, what could be some potential steps that a person can take in order to, rectify some of those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So very much possible to rectify any mistakes for sure. So it's always best to obviously get on the front foot. If you have made a mistake, you have options to amend your return. You can do a voluntary disclosure with the ATO. And normally it's relatively simple to do an amendment within 2 years of your own personal tax returns, which is normally the recommended way to go for sure. So I think that's a really key message. I think if you have made a mistake or perhaps haven't got the best advice previously, you certainly have the option to go back and rectify the situation, normally without any penalties or adverse implication. Yeah.
Thank you, Bradley. And my last question is that if someone wants to become a non-tax resident from an Australian perspective, what should be some possible next steps for them to take in order to make sure that they do everything properly?
Yeah, so I think, first off, it's really important just to look at your overall situation. So look at, your business ties, your employment ties. Is it an option for you to move your employment or business overseas? Where are your family based? Is it an option for your family to move overseas with you, or are they staying back in Australia? You need to look at all these factors in totality. It's a holistic test, so there is no, I guess, one factor that's going to make you a non-tax resident. There really are 10 sort of key factors here that look at, as I mentioned, your business ties, family ties, where your assets are based, where's your accommodation based, do you have a visa overseas, are you transferring money into Australia? All those things play a part in this test. So just make sure you speak to the right experts about becoming a non-tax resident, get the right advice, make sure you've got an opinion from the advisor to say that you are a non-tax resident, you've got support to file your Australian tax return as a non-tax resident. That's also important. So I think really important to have something in writing to verify that you're a non-tax resident.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bradley, for your time. And thanks to you for joining us today. Yeah.
Thank you, Shiraz. Pleasure. Thanks for your time.